August 17, 1943. The Sicilian dawn was choked with dust. Two columns raced along twisting roads toward Messina. One carried the British flag. The other flew the American stars. The soldiers inside those vehicles were spent, blistered, half asleep, but their generals were wide awake. This was no longer about defeating Germany. It was about arriving first. George S. Patton leaned forward in his command car, urging speed from a driver who had nothing left to give. Somewhere on another road, Bernard Montgomery was doing the same, convinced destiny owed him one more victory. Messina was not just a port. It was a symbol. Whoever entered the city first would write the headline for the entire campaign. Whoever arrived second would carry the sting for the rest of the war. By nightfall, American infantry pushed through exhaustion and scattered resistance. At dawn, they marched into the city. Hours later, British troops followed, finding foreign flags already flying. The race was over. The resentment was just beginning. To understand how this moment happened, you have to understand the men who made it inevitable. To understand why Messina mattered so much, you have to understand Bernard Montgomery long before he ever set foot on Sicily. By the summer of 1943, Montgomery was no longer merely a battlefield commander. He was an institution. Britain had entered the war with supreme confidence and emerged shaken to its core. France collapsed in weeks. Dunkirk was a miracle born of defeat. Singapore fell. Tobruk fell twice. British armies surrendered in numbers not seen in generations. The empire that had once dictated the terms of global war now struggled simply to survive it. Then came North Africa, when Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army in 1942. He inherited a force exhausted by retreat and eroded by doubt. What he brought was not innovation, but certainty. He promised no daring maneuvers, no brilliant improvisation. He promised preparation. He promised overwhelming force. And above all, he promised that there would be no more retreats. At El Alamein, Montgomery delivered. He fought the Germans head-on and broke them. It was not subtle. It was not elegant. But it worked. For the first time since 1918, a British general had defeated the German army in a decisive, set-piece battle. The psychological impact was immense. El Alamein was hailed as the turning point of the war in the desert, and Montgomery became its living symbol. From that moment on, Montgomery's reputation hardened into something close to doctrine. He spoke in absolutes. He projected unwavering confidence. Doubt, especially public doubt, had no place in his command. The British press adored him. Politicians trusted him. His methods were no longer questioned, they were accepted as fact. George S. Patton watched all of this from the margins. Patton had spent his entire career preparing for a modern war that few others believed would come. He embraced tanks when the cavalry still defined prestige. He studied mobility, shock, and speed while most generals fixated on lines and logistics. To Patton, war was movement. Hesitation was death, but when American forces finally met the Germans in Tunisia, theory collided with reality and collapsed. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, U.S. units broke under pressure. Command structures failed. Units fled. The defeat was public, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. Patton was brought in to clean up the wreckage. What followed was transformation through fear and discipline. Patton enforced standards relentlessly. Helmets were mandatory. Uniforms were inspected. Salutes were enforced. Officers who failed were removed. Cowardice was punished. There were no speeches about morale, there were consequences. Within weeks, the same formations that had fled at Kasserine were holding their ground against German counterattacks. By the end of the North African campaign, American troops were no longer novices. They had learned the war the hard way. But history did not notice. Victory in North Africa was framed through a British lens, and Montgomery stood at its center. Patton, despite the turnaround he had overseen, was seen as a supporting figure, a subordinate who arrived late to an already won fight. The imbalance rankled. The resentment took root there. Long before Sicily was even named, When the Allies began planning their invasion of Sicily in 1943, Montgomery moved to shape the operation around himself. He demanded priority in landings. He demanded control of the main axis of advance. His argument was simple and difficult to counter. His methods had worked before, and this operation was too important to risk experimentation. Eisenhower, tasked with holding together a fragile Anglo-American alliance, gave way. Montgomery's 8th Army would drive up the eastern coast toward Messina. Patton's 7th Army would guard the western flank, a secondary role with no clear path to distinction. Patton was furious, but he obeyed. Then Montgomery stalled. The terrain along Sicily's eastern coast was worse than expected. Narrow roads, rugged hills, and well-prepared German defenses turned Montgomery's deliberate style into a liability. British attacks bogged down. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted. Days passed, then weeks, from the west. Patton watched his army sit idle. When permission finally came to advance, Patton unleashed everything he believed in. His columns surged forward with speed and aggression the campaign had not yet seen. Towns fell in rapid succession. Palermo, the island's largest city, was captured in a matter of days. The effect was electric. The press noticed. Allied headquarters noticed. The narrative began to shift. Patton was no longer guarding a flank, he was rewriting the campaign. And then he turned east. At that moment, Sicily ceased to be a coordinated operation. It became something else entirely. A race, a test of reputations. A collision of two men who believed history belonged to them. Messina waited at the end of the road. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. The consequences of Sicily did not end on that island. They followed both men across the Mediterranean, across the Channel, and into the hedgerows of France, where reputation mattered almost as much as results. When the invasion of Normandy was planned, Bernard Montgomery stood at the summit of his career. He was appointed overall commander of Allied ground forces for the landings, a role that formalized what had already become reality. In Allied councils, Montgomery's voice carried weight. His confidence, once reassuring, now shaped entire strategies. He promised clarity, control, and steady progress. He promised that Normandy would be executed methodically, without unnecessary risk. George Patton, by contrast, was sidelined, officially. He was given command of the 1st U.S. Army Group in honor in name only. In reality, it was a phantom force, a deception designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and carefully planted intelligence leaks created the illusion of Patton waiting to strike. The Germans believed it precisely because Patton's reputation for aggression made it believable. For weeks, Patton commanded an army that did not exist. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. Montgomery had promised a rapid breakout, particularly in the British and Canadian sectors around Caen. He believed the Germans would crumble under sustained pressure, allowing Allied forces to pour into open country beyond the beaches. They did not. The British sector became a brutal contest of attrition. Bocage terrain-dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and fortified villages favored the defender. German armor and infantry fought stubbornly, turning every town into a fortress. Caen, meant to fall within days, took weeks. Casualties mounted. Progress slowed to a crawl. Montgomery explained the delays calmly. The terrain was difficult. The weather was poor. German resistance was stronger than anticipated. All of these were true. What Montgomery never entertained, publicly or privately, was that his own approach might be part of the problem. His insistence on rigid control limited initiative. His caution ceded tempo to the enemy. Still, his reputation shielded him. Failures were framed as deliberate containment. Stagnation was described as fixing German forces in place. Montgomery was not losing, he was shaping the battlefield. Patton watched from England. In August, after the Allied breakout at Operation Cobra finally cracked the German line, Patton was unleashed at last. He took command of the U.S. Third Army and did exactly what Montgomery feared and admired in equal measure. He moved Patton's armored columns surged through the gaps left by retreating German units. Towns fell without extended fighting. Roads clogged with prisoners. Entire divisions were cut off and forced to surrender simply because Patton's forces were everywhere at once. Supply officers struggled to keep up. Maps were outdated within days because the front lines moved faster than cartographers could redraw them. In weeks. Patton achieved operational results others had failed to produce in months. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The press followed speed. Photographs showed liberated cities, long columns of prisoners, tanks racing through open countryside. Patton's image helmet polished, pistols visible fit perfectly with the story of relentless momentum. Public admiration followed naturally. Montgomery bristled. He warned Allied leadership that Patton was reckless, that his advances were dangerously overextended. He argued that such speed invited disaster, that German counterattacks could cut Patton off and destroy him. These warnings were not unfounded, but the disaster never came. Patton's instincts for movement, combined with German disarray, kept him just ahead of catastrophe. With every mile Patton advanced, Montgomery's authority eroded. As the Allies pushed toward Germany, resources tightened. Fuel became the limiting factor. Not every commander could be supported equally, and hard choices had to be made. Montgomery saw an opportunity to reclaim dominance not through steady pressure, but through a single dramatic stroke. Operation Market Garden was his answer. The plan was bold to the point of audacity. Airborne divisions would seize a series of bridges deep inside the Netherlands. Ground forces would race up a narrow corridor to relieve them. If it worked, Allied forces would leapfrog the German defenses, cross the Rhine, and potentially end the war before Christmas. It was exactly the kind of decisive victory Montgomery believed his reputation demanded. It failed. Airborne units landed farther from objectives than planned. Intelligence underestimated German strength. Narrow roads became death traps. Relief columns moved too slowly. One bridge too far became a fatal reality. Thousands of airborne troops were killed or captured. Strategic objectives were missed entirely. The war did not end early. It dragged on into the winter. Patton, denied fuel to support Montgomery's gamble, watched from a standstill. His army, poised to continue its advance, sat idle while resources were diverted north. When Market Garden collapsed, the opportunity Patton had been denied could not be reclaimed. The rivalry that had begun in Sicily had now shaped the course of the war in Europe. Proof that reputation, once earned, can be both a weapon and a burden. When the Germans struck through the Ardennes in December 1944, they did not just launch a counteroffensive, they tore open the fragile assumptions holding the Allied command together. Snow choked the roads, grounded aircraft. Communications collapsed. American units, stretched thin and still advancing, were hit by the full weight of Germany's last gamble in the West. Chaos followed. German armor smashed into the Ardennes forest, creating a deep bulge in the Allied lines. Entire divisions were cut off. Commanders struggled to understand what was happening, let alone control it. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as though the war might slide backward into stalemate or worse, yet the American lines bent, and they did not break. At Allied headquarters, confusion reigned. Plans were scrapped. Timetables dissolved. Command relationships frayed under pressure. Eisenhower faced the greatest crisis of his command, one that demanded speed, clarity, and absolute confidence. George Patton was ready, before the crisis fully unfolded. Patton had already anticipated the possibility of a German counterattack. His staff had contingency plans drafted. When Eisenhower asked how quickly Patton could pivot his Third Army north to meet the threat, the expected answer was weeks. Patton answered, days. What followed bordered on the impossible. In the depths of winter, on icy roads under enemy pressure, Patton executed a massive operational turn, rotating his entire army 90 degrees while in contact with the enemy. Divisions disengaged, redeployed, and advanced through snowstorms and darkness. Supply lines were rerouted on the move. Orders were issued, revised, and executed at a pace that defied conventional military logic. Within days, Patton's spearheads were driving toward Bastogne. There, The 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units were surrounded, cut off, and running low on supplies. German commanders believed Bastogne would fall. Instead, Patton's armor punched through the encirclement. Restoring the line and shattering German momentum, the Bulge collapsed, not because the Germans lacked courage or strength, but because they had lost the race. Once again, speed proved decisive. The Battle of the Bulge marked the effective end of Germany's offensive capability in the West. From that point forward, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, and then Montgomery spoke at a press conference in January 1945. Bernard Montgomery addressed the battle not as one commander among many, but as its architect. He claimed that Allied forces had been on the brink of collapse when he took control. He implied that American units had faltered under pressure. He framed the victory as the result of his calm leadership and deliberate planning. Patton was barely mentioned. The reaction was immediate and furious. American commanders, officers, and soldiers felt betrayed. Men who had fought and died in the snow heard their efforts diminished before the world. Eisenhower was livid. Trust within the alliance cracked in a way it never fully healed. Montgomery insisted he had been misunderstood. He claimed his words were misinterpreted by the press. But the damage was done. What had once been seen as confidence now sounded like arrogance. What had once been certainty now felt like appropriation. From that moment on, Montgomery's reputation never fully recovered. The war continued, but the balance of prestige had shifted. As Allied forces closed on Germany, the final acts of the rivalry played out along the Rhine. Montgomery planned meticulously for his crossing. Operation Plunder was a massive, carefully staged affair: airborne drops, artillery preparation, rigid timetables. It reflected everything Montgomery believed in: overwhelming force, total control, and deliberate execution. Then, south of his sector, American forces crossed first at Remagen. U.S. troops discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. There was no grand plan, no weeks of preparation, no perfectly synchronized operation. There was only opportunity and the decision to seize it. American engineers rushed forward under fire. Infantry crossed the bridge as German demolitions failed. Within hours, a bridgehead existed east of the Rhine, achieved through improvisation and speed rather than design. Once again, preparation lost to momentum. Montgomery's crossing succeeded days later, but the moment had passed. The symbolic barrier guarding Germany's heartland had already been breached, not by the most careful plan, but by the fastest decision. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the contrast between the two men was unmistakable. Montgomery survived. He wrote memoirs. He defended his decisions. He shaped his legacy with words, explanations, and justifications. His name remained prominent in official histories and British memory. Patton did not. He died months later in a car accident. His war ended not in triumph or disgrace, but in silence. He left no memoir to argue his case, no final defense, no carefully curated legacy. And yet history is not written by memoirs alone. It is written by results measured on maps, in timelines, and in outcomes that cannot be explained away. It is written in armies turned in winter, in cities liberated ahead of schedule, in bridges seized before they could be destroyed, in wars shortened not by caution but by movement. The rivalry between Montgomery and Patton was never just personal. It was philosophical. Control versus tempo, preparation versus audacity, certainty versus intuition. Both men mattered. Both contributed. But when the verdict is weighed not in speeches, not in press conferences, not in reputation, the pattern is clear. Speed decided battles. Momentum shaped campaigns. And adaptability broke the enemy. That is the verdict history delivers on the greatest rivalry of World War II. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. In the end, both men received exactly what they had been fighting for. Even if neither fully understood the price at the time, one was given command. He was given structure, authority, and the resources to shape campaigns from conference rooms and map tables. He was given the trust of politicians, the loyalty of institutions, and the luxury of time to plan, to justify, and ultimately to explain himself in his own words. When the war ended, he lived on. He wrote, he spoke. He defended his decisions and preserved his version of events for future generations. The other was given movement, he was given pressure, uncertainty, and battles that had to be won in real time, without guarantees and without safety nets. He was given moments where hesitation meant failure and speed meant survival. His victories could not be prepared into inevitability, they had to be seized before they vanished. And when the war ended, his voice did not carry into the peace. There were no memoirs written in hindsight, no long years to soften the edges or reshape the narrative. History listened to both, but it believed only one because reputation can be managed. Authority can be assigned. Titles can be granted and speeches can be delivered. But results have a way of surviving excuses. They endure long after justifications fade and explanations lose their power. When the noise dies down and the memoirs gather dust, what remains are the outcomes that changed the course of the war, and the commanders who delivered them when it mattered most. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It is not about arrogance versus humility or brilliance versus caution. It is about a truth war exposes with brutal clarity. Certainty feels safe, but adaptability wins. Control creates order, but momentum creates collapse. Plans can be perfect on paper and still fail the moment reality intervenes. Some men are remembered because they lived long enough to tell their story. Others are remembered because the story told itself written in liberated cities, broken enemy lines, and wars shortened by decisions made under pressure. Silence did not erase those achievements. It amplified them. The rivalry between these two generals was never just personal. It reflected a deeper conflict inside every coalition, every organization, every moment of crisis, whether to cling to authority or trust results, whether to protect reputation or risk everything to move forward. And in that rivalry, one defined by speeches, speed, and the unforgiving judgment of history, the general who fell silent became the one history refused to forget. If you want more stories where myth collides with reality, where reputations are tested against outcomes, and where history is rewound not to glorify but to understand, this is WW2 Rewind.